mean, in the Middle Ages, the church forbade dissection of human bodies, and medical students would visit battlefields and the gallows at night and steal the bodies of victims of war and executed prisoners in order to learn human physiology. Where that spirit of scientific courage has gone, I don't know, but there's very little of it left. Now people feed at the trough of government grants and enormous corporate research budgets, and the idea of actually pursuing truth or attempting to understand the phenomenon in an unbiased fashion, divorced from its commercial, social, and political dimensions, is unheard of. Yeah.
I wonder if one of the reasons isn't that in order to feel safe, we have to be able to control people and make them predictable. The church tried to do that. All these different institutions seek to control people through fear and guilt. And the more dangerous times become, the more we treat an outside enemy to control people.
Well, yes, I think you put your finger on precisely the issue, because, and slightly anticipating my argument, what psychedelics do, if you look at thousands of these experiences, is they dissolve boundaries. They dissolve boundaries between you and your past, you and the part of your unconscious you don't want to look at, between you and your partner, between you and the feminine if you're masculine, and vice versa, between you and the world. All the boundaries that we put up to keep ourselves from feeling our circumstance are dissolved. And boundary dissolution is the most threatening activity that can go on in a society. People, meaning government institutions, become very nervous when people begin to talk to each other. Yes, the whole name of the Western game is to create boundaries and maintain them. The church and the state, the poor and the wealthy, the black and the white, the male and the female, the young and the old, the gay and the straight, the living and the dead, the foreign and the familiar. All of these categorical divisions allow a kind of thinking that is completely cockamamie. After all, reality is, in fact, a seamless, unspeakable something. And we understand that to perceive it separately is a necessary adjunct to the act of understanding. But it is not the end of the program of understanding. The particulate data has to be recombined in a paradigm, a seamless overview of what is happening. And the drugs that Western society has traditionally favored have either been drugs which maintain boundaries or drugs which promote mindless, repetitious physical activity on the assembly line, in the slave galley, on the latifundia, the slave-driven agricultural project, whatever it is.
In the corporate office.
In the corporate office. This is why, every labor contract on this planet, at least in Western civilization, contains a provision that all workers shall be allowed to use drugs twice a day at designated times, but the drug shall be caffeine. Now, the reason caffeine is so welcome in the workplace is because the last 3 hours of the workday are utterly unproductive unless you goose everybody with 2 cups of coffee, and then they can go back to the word processor, the widget typing machine, or whatever they're doing, and mindlessly and happily carry on. If it were suggested that there be a pot break, you would think that civilization was striking the iceberg. is an alcohol, red meat, sugar, and tobacco culture. And all of these are forms of speed, basically, in the way that we use them. I mean, yes, you can tranquilize yourself on alcohol, but you're pushing toward levels where a lifetime of tranquilizing yourself on alcohol would be a short lifetime if you use it that way. So there's a lot of tension in society between the great exploring soul and the assembly line citizen. The citizen is defined by obligation and by the boundaries that define, the next citizen, either because it's neighbor or worker or employer or something like that. And the grand exploring soul is marginalized as an eccentric, or if necessary, more seriously marginalized as mad in some way. I mean, madness basically, up until the level of physical violence, means you are behaving in a way which makes me feel uncomfortable, therefore there's something wrong with you. Yes. So, this now, it's interesting, and this is one of the points that are dear to me, and they arrive in different orders each time. But I think of history as a kind of mass psychedelic experience, and the drug is technology. And as technology gets more and more perfected as a mirror of the human mind, the cultural experience becomes more and more hallucinatory. And for at least the past couple of hundred years, boundary dissolution has been underway at every level of Western civilization. I mean, we could push it further back. The Magna Carta, the fact that princes and lords of the realm would actually attempt to force the king's signature on a document defining their privileges. They are, after all, ordinary human beings. The king is the divine appointed regent of God in heaven. So this was a severe boundary dissolution in the context of the age in which it was taking place. They were actually saying, you as Christ's representative on earth should see some of this omnipotence to us, mere mortals suspended in the political process. Well, that leads then to broader demands for human rights, for the idea that a permanent and large segment of society kept in permanent poverty is unacceptable. We got rid of debtors' prisons, things like this. As the collectivity of our humanness becomes an intellectual legacy for all of us, there is a dissolving of boundaries of race, class, status, language, so forth and so on. And the whole of the 20th century has seen a massive acceleration of this. The breakdown of the Soviet Union was in fact simply, it was even so described, the lifting of the Iron Curtain, meaning a membrane has suddenly disappeared. And more of these membranes are disappearing. And what is emerging then is a more and more psychedelic experience, meaning a sense of acceleration of information flow, a sense of rising ambiguity about what it all means. Everything seems to carry both a good facet and a detrimental facet. The ambiguity of everything is increasing. The connectedness of everything is increased. Time and space in which we are embedded, and that we ourselves are a reflection of this. So this then goes toward addressing the first question that was that was outlined in the little flyer describing the weekend. Where is life carrying us? What is this all about? Is it carrying us toward extinction so that the rest of nature can heave an enormous sigh of relief and then get back to the business of nest building, mating flights, and oviposturing, and whatever it is that they're doing out there? Or is it carrying us toward some kind of a transition? If you look back through the history of life, which is a long history, I mean, it reaches back a billion years, it's every advance happens suddenly, unpredictably, and in a very short period of time. Some of you who stay tuned to the scientific literature may have noticed this series of articles that were around last week about what they're calling the Big Bang of biology. That there was a period of time, incredibly brief, perhaps between 1 million and 10 million years, when all the phyla of life on this planet radiated into existence, sometime between 525 and 535 million years ago. Just it all smacked into existence. The episode in which life left the sea is a similar, highly confined transition event. People recently have written about what they call punctated or punctuated evolution. Evolution is not apparently a slow curve of unfoldment. It is instead a series of equilibrium states punctuated by violent fluctuation in between, and then a new equilibrium state. So history, I believe, is not an aberration any more than leaving the sea could be called an aberration of marine existence. I mean, obviously it is not marine existence, and obviously we are not living in the same world as groundhogs and birds psychologically. But leaving the sea did not represent an ontological transition. It represented an extremely dramatic shift of modality. And this is what history is. History is characterized by its brevity, for one thing. I mean, we have packed more change into the last 10,000 years than the billion years which preceded it. I mean, and yet as entities, as animals, meat, we have not changed at all in 10,000 years. If you were to go back to that era, the people would be exactly like people we see today. They wouldn't be so racially heterogeneous because the great gene streamings and migrations that characterize history have not yet taken place. But essentially, perfectly modern people. Well, then history is apparently, if we view it as a process that nature tolerates, if not encourages, then history is essentially, apparently, important enough to place, to jeopardize the stability of all the rest of the natural ecosystemic world. It's as though nature is saying we are willing to place the entire planetary ecology in danger for 50,000 years in order for the opportunity to be explored of language using, technologically expressing intelligence, carrying all of life to the next level. And it's a terrifying enterprise because apparently to carry life to the next level, tremendous intellectual sophistication is required about the release and control of energy. The problem is energy can be used to destroy as well as build. So as the human enterprise has moved towards greater and greater power and ability to manipulate the environment, the stakes in the cosmic game have risen. And now what we have is approximately $100 billion sitting in the center of the craft table, and one roll of the dice or more, and we're going to either win it or lose everything. Because intelligence, if we fail, will never again reach the kind of levels on this planet that we have reached. Why? Because we have extracted all the available metals near the surface of the Earth. An evolving species following after us will find the Earth strangely depleted of usable materials down to the 1,500-foot level. And so intelligence coming beyond us will find it just does not have the resources to make the leap to technical civilization. So it's beginning to look like a one-shot deal. And the psychedelics are in there for two reasons. First of all, because they allow us as individuals to break out of the flat cultural illusion and to rise up and look at this situation. So it's for us a tool to understand our predicament. But the psychedelics are also what has driven this circumstance to arise in part. Because what psychedelics do, and I think this isn't too challengeable, is they catalyze imagination. They drive you to think what you would not think otherwise. Well, notice that the enterprise of human history is nothing more than the fallout created by strange ideas. You know, let's build a pyramid. Let's build a windmill. Let's build a water wheel. You know, and then empires, philosophies, religions arise in the wake of these situations. I've argued in the past, and I think try not to repeat it here today, because I think you've all heard it, but I would mention it in a sentence or two, that the critical catalyst propelling us out of the slowly evolving hominid line and it caused us to take an orthogonal right-hand turn into culture, language, art, yearning, probably was the inclusion of psychedelic plants in our diet during that episodic moment when we went from being fruitarian canopy dwellers to omnivorous pack-hunting creatures of the grassland. And it was the inclusion of psilocybin in our grassland diet that caused us to discover that there is a mind, and you can perturb it. I mean, think about, I don't think you could discover consciousness if you didn't perturb it, because as Marshall McLuhan said, whoever discovered water, it certainly wasn't a fish. Well, we are fish swimming in consciousness, and yet we know it's there. Well, the reason we know it's there is because if you perturb it, then you see it, and you perturb it by perturbing the engine which generates it, which is the mind-brain system resting behind your eyebrows. If you swap out the ordinary chemicals that are running that system in an invisible fashion, then you see it's like dropping ink into a bowl of clear water. Suddenly the convection currents operating in the clear water become visible because you see the particles of ink tracing out the previously into a bowl of clear water. Suddenly the convection currents operating in the clear water become visible because you see the particles of ink tracing out the previously invisible dynamics of the standing water. The mind is precisely like that. And the psychedelic is like a dye marker being dropped into this aqueous system. And then you say, oh, I see. It works like this and like this. Well, if psychedelics are catalysts for the imagination, and if history is driven by the imagination, it is driven through the fallout from the imagination, which is technology and culture. Technology and culture are the consequences, the derivatives of the ratiocination of the mind. And technology has biological life, but on a much faster or accelerated time frame. Technology has this weird tendency to transcend itself, to bootstrap itself. You know, if you have a cart, then it implies better wheels, better bearings, better structure, and then higher speed, more control, more feedback from the machine. It means we need gas gauges, RPM readouts, so forth and so on. Technology, strangely enough, created by a biological creature, has itself this self-transcending quality, but ever accelerating. This is the important point, because the ever accelerating accretion of technology means that history is strangely foreshortened at the future end, because it happens faster and faster. It's like a process that begins very slowly, but once started has the quality of a cascade. Or the rate at which falling bodies move, 32.5 feet per second. Each second accelerates to twice the rate of fall that was occurring in the previous second. Technology is like this, and we now are in a domain where if we attempt to propagate technological development forward 50 years, it becomes unmanageable as an intellectual task. We can talk about the automobile, what it might look like 50 years from now. It would float, it would go 500 miles an hour, it would be guided by your mind, and so forth and so on. These kinds of ideas. Every artifact of our world will undergo that kind of transformation, and that the synergy among these transformed objects will create phenomena and situations that we can't anticipate. That's the key thing. Our inability to anticipate the synergies between our technologies. I mean, the computer, LSD, spacecraft, holograms, organic superconductivity. Those are just 6 areas where the integration of those concerns will produce unimaginable consequences. Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's not what happened when Mary, I forget his name, tried to do with the psychedelics. He didn't push it too hard, too fast. Most people are not ready for it. So the government came and put everything into the illegal, and nobody did anything about it. So they're not ready.
You mean you're referring to the 60s?
Yes.
Well, yeah, I'm not sure the people weren't ready. Clearly the government wasn't ready, and probably isn't ready today. The government is not ready to embrace psychedelics, but what the government of today, the way in which today's government differs from the 60s government, is there is a spreading sense of great uncertainty. Government in the 1960s believed in what it was doing. Now, I think government exists simply to mitigate panic.
But I believe the people are ready. The government most time don't understand.
No, the people are ready, and the people then have to set the social agenda. A progressive society is a society where the social agenda is set by the people. And a authoritarian society, that's the only difference, is a society where the agenda is handed down from the top.
If the people already could now, with all of you ready, for example, to have a people sue on the government for letting cigarettes, alcohol, that are in medicine, that are very harmful for people, illegal, and take what is good and make that illegal.
Well, I go back and forth about this. Sometimes I think the best strategy with the government is to ignore it. The government is only as real as you think it is. I mean, if everybody agreed it doesn't exist, it would have a hell of a time prosecuting its agenda. On the other hand, that's sort of the romantic perfectionist approach, I suppose. And the practical approach, it would be to try and change the government's attitude.
Well,
For example,
it still wouldn't change it, but at least it would bring some awareness.
Well,
They would have to deal with it.
it might
That's the
change it.
way.
I mean, the government does follow, in some cases, its own rules. Usually when other people are watching. But for example, if you go back to this situation where the psychedelics were made illegal in 1966, somebody jumped out of a dorm window at the University of Michigan or something, and so they decided LSD was the scourge of mankind, and that they would make it illegal. In California, we're talking about now. But they said, well, as long as we're making this hallucinogen illegal, let's make all hallucinogens illegal. So psilocybin was made illegal at the same time that LSD was. Well, no medical or social evidence was ever presented that there was anything wrong with psilocybin. In other words, the ordinary process of making a compound illegal is you hold hearings and you bring in medical data. This many people died, there were this many emergency room admissions, so on. Here is the RAP data, here's the profile on this. In the case of psilocybin, no medical or scientific data of any sort was ever presented to anybody. And it was made illegal in California. And when the feds came along 8 months later, decided to make all these things illegal nationwide, they said California already has a good, strong law. Let's just take the California language and drop it into the federal statute. So it would be possible, if you had $3 million to burn, to take a case to the Supreme Court and to fight the legal status of psilocybin on the grounds that no scientific evidence was ever presented there was anything wrong with it. That would at least have the effect of forcing a government-sponsored study of the human impact of psilocybin. This is now actually being done at the University of New Mexico, but it should have been done 35 years ago. It's a very disturbing situation. Yeah.
I think it kind of points up where the decisions made on rational reasonableness are driven by fear. And
Control.
well, because loss of control is very fearful. And it's very fearful for most people to lose control. And so any situation where it touches themselves, I might lose control, they put a touch on it. Because my head is swimming from all the things you were saying. One of the things that the history is driven by technology. I'm wondering control. And so any situation where it touches themselves, I might lose control, they put a touch on it. Because my head is swimming from all the things you were saying. One of the things that the history is driven by technology. I'm wondering, that raises the question of where the role of fear, greed, ego development, all these individual human emotions how they fit in on the technology, history is moving like this and sort of moving independent of any individual. And yet I think what kings are individuals, and what they do and how they impact things and how the government suppresses is based on individual fear. Kind of want maybe to touch on that.
Well, the key word in what you said, as I heard it, was ego and fear. The ultimate boundary dissolution is the dissolution of ego. I mean, we straight people hope that they never meet it except at death. Of course, they don't realize going to sleep at night is a kind of ego dissolution. But the government is expressive of this dominator culture that we're living in. The ego is a very recent invention, and its hold on reality is very tender, and consequently it walks around imbued with fear. I mean, it feels itself to be a mouse in the world of dinosaurs. That's because it's a very recent development. I guess I have to go back to this scenario of human development and say, just very briefly, here's how I think this works. I'm not going to run through the whole evolutionary scenario, but this thing about ego. All primates have what are called dominant hierarchies. That simply means that the hard-bodied, long-fanged young males kick everybody else around. They control the female, the children, homosexuals, the elderly, everybody is taking orders from this dominant hierarchy. And this is true clear back into squirrel monkeys. It's a generalized feature of primate behavior. And it's an aspect of our behavior. As we sit here, women, the feminine is not honored, the elderly are marginalized, homosexuals, that's that whole issue. Many of our social and political ills stem from this attitude. Well, but you see, I believe that when we let the trees and admitted psilocybin into our diet, that it has the effect of dissolving boundaries and making this maintenance of a dominant hierarchy very, very difficult. First of all, the key on one level to maintaining the dominant hierarchy is monogamous pair bonding. That's where it begins. In a society taking a lot of psilocybin, monogamous pair bonding breaks down because of CNS activation and sexual arousal. So in a psilocybin-using culture, there will be a tendency to orgiastic sexual behavior rather than monogamous pair bonding. What that does is it causes an incredible social cohesion, because in an orgiastic society, men cannot trace lines of male paternity. So men's attitude toward children is, these children are all ours. We, the group. It's a glue that we, in our paranoid social style, with everybody having the deed to their property and their 11 Hanukkah 5 cents, can hardly imagine. But psilocybin was artificially suppressing this dominator behavior style in the primates, the evolving proto-hominid, now hominid, now human being. When psilocybin was taken out of the diet, the old primate program was still there. It had not been bred out. The genes were always there. It's just that for 50,000 or 100,000 years we medicated ourselves
literally religious. We religiously medicated ourselves every noon and full moon, perhaps oftener. These orgies were happening, creating social cohesion, propagating everybody forward. The problem was, when the psilocybin was taken away, we had been under its influence for perhaps half a million years. We had evolved language, rudimentary abstract philosophy, a sense of religion. We had invented technology in the form of using fire and chipping flint and all that. The psilocybin goes away, and suddenly these skills, these tools, these technologies are in the hands of marauding apes. Not anymore cohesive, caring human social groups, but marauding territorial apes, driven by the desire to control all weaker members of the social group. And that's our circumstance. We have, the tools that would allow us to sculpt paradise, but we have the reflexes and value systems of anthropoid apes of some sort. So the split between our conscious pulse, our best foot, and the bottom of the human scale is appalling. I mean, look at the spread. It's the spread from from Mother Teresa to serial killers. I mean, you don't get serial killers in the chipmunk population or the grasshopper population. And these animals are not so set at variance with their basic nature that these kinds of pathologies can erupt. We, on the other hand, are half-angel, half-pack-hunting killer apes. And it doesn't depend on which side of the bed you get up on, or whether you get.
Regarding the technological experiment, and along these lines, I wonder if it's not a dual thing where technology gives us an indication of what is possible, and psychedelics expand that so that we can actually get to where we're supposed to be. Technology could, well, let's put it this way, you cannot imagine something that you have no experience whatsoever with, as a general rule. Therefore, if you have masses of people and not enough psilocybin to go around, or other hallucinogenics, you have to give them some basis on which to have a vision, or whatever. Television, automobiles, and airplanes do supply at least the idea that these things are possible without the technology when you get to the psilocybin or to the hallucinogenic.
Yeah, I mean, we're an object fetish society. I mean, our entire psychology is characterized by a profound discontent. That's what we're about. It doesn't matter. No matter what's going on, after a little while, we get restless and move on. Other animal species are embedded in a kind of world of endless genetic cycling. No fox grows bored with hunting, and yet our thing is a profound dis-ease. And I believe it's because, and slowly sports can do this whole rap.
The question reflects on it is that the whole psychedelic issue is being transformed by the fact that information is being spread around about how there are many, many plants which, not psychoactive by themselves, can be combined to produce essentially pseudo-ayahuascas of various sorts. So it's not necessary to go to the Peruvian Amazon. It's not necessary to even use Amazonian plants. There are perfectly good Native American plants that can be combined together to produce very spectacular experiences. And if you want to get into underground science at the cutting edge, making and testing these things on yourself and your friends is guaranteed to keep your life interesting. I'll just give one example and then you're sort of on your own. But there is a plant called Pergamon harmala, or Syrian rue, a woody plant that has become a problem out near Fallon, Nevada, and north of Elko on Highway 5, and out near Deming, New Mexico, and south eastern Arizona. Anyway, a range plant, something you encounter it can go for miles along the highway. This is an extraordinarily potent source of harmaline. And harmaline, don't forget, is more hallucinogenic and less toxic than harmine. Harmine occurs in Banisteriopsis coptic, the source of ayahuasca. Harmaline, it is possible, we need to do more research, but it's possible that harmaline on its own is an interesting hallucinogen. Certainly, when you take Pergamon harmala and boil it together with the root bark scrapings of another North American plant, Desmanthus illinoisensis, the Illinois bundleweed, this plant has more DMT in it than any other plant ever measured. And it's very interesting that as far as we can tell, it was not known by the North American Indians. I mean, this is controversial because why is it called bundleweed? Bundle, in that context, signifies medicine bundle, as in a shaman's mojo bag. So why is it called bundleweed if nobody ever knew that it got you high? Yeah?
Well, it's called bundleweed because of the appearance of the seed pods. It's also called spider bean, and the seed pods look like a little curled up spider or a bundle. I was wondering what that means myself, but that's what I
There
found
you are. Know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. It may prick your bubble.
There's another interesting thing about it is about these two cryptic hallucinogens. It was used as a skin remedy, and Argyria nervosa was used as a skin remedy in India as well, Ayurvedic medicine, and it's also a cryptic hallucinogen. It has lysergic acid amides in it. So I wonder if
Yes,
there's enough connection.
Argyria nervosa, if you're an enthusiast of obscure hallucinogens, this is one to reckon with. Possibly, gram for gram, it is the most powerful plant hallucinogen on the planet because it only takes 5 or 6 small seeds. And interestingly enough, it's quite accessible. In other words, all you do is pound the seeds and eat it. And yet, though there are 13 species of Argyria, all containing psychoactive compounds, spread from Kerala in India down through Micronesia, there's no history of human usage in that entire cultural area. So there are mysteries about who knows these things. You know, when you go to the Amazon, most people have a kind of noble savage prejudice, and they think that it has to be the naked people who are off-river, who are very wild and woolly, and then they make the good ayahuasca. Often this is not the case. Often it's the guy who lives on the edge of Iquitos or Pucallpa who tends his garden and is fairly conversant with the modern world. Some of you may know Manuel F. Bruce Lamb's book, Rio Tigre and Beyond. He describes a situation in there where a man who had in his youth been kidnapped by Indians and learned to make very good ayahuasca. Later, he encounters another tribe of Indians. He's on a rosewood collecting expedition to a remote part of the jungle. And he encounters these Indians and they invite him to take ayahuasca with them. And it's just garbage. It's part of this guy. So he says, I'll show you how they do it where I come from, and makes it for these people, and literally becomes a culture hero overnight, is hailed as the great reformer of their ritual, just simply because he showed them how to get really, really smashed.
Can you teach us how to do that? The second plant, the DMT supplier, how do you spell the name?
Oh, just
Where can you find it?
DESMANTHUS.
DESMAN.
THUS, and then Illinoisensis, simply the state of Illinois with ensis after it, thus not putting myself to the test of spelling Illinois. And yeah, the DMT is in the desmanthus, and the predominant contains the MAO inhibiting harmaline.
It's in the seed of this man.
No, it's in the root bark scrapings. And the harmala, the harmine, the harmaline in predominant harmala is spread throughout the plant and concentrated in the little black seeds. If you don't want to drive out to Elko, find an Iranian market here in LA and tell them that you want to buy Hermal, HURMAL, and they will sell you the seeds of predominant harmala. It's used in Iranian households as a fumigant and incense. You just throw some on a charcoal, on a bed of coals, and it makes this wonderful incense-like smoke, which is actually intoxicating. I mean, a wonderful thing to do if you want to do some exploratory chemistry is take half the dose of mushrooms, and then after a couple of hours, smoke some predominant harmala in a bong or a pipe, and the MAO inhibiting characteristic of the harmaline will immediately lift the curtain for about 15 minutes on a very spectacular series of very cool hallucinations. In other words, they're hallucinations where you can just sit and look, thinking, my goodness, this is fascinating and compelling, rather than the other kind of hallucination where you're... We call this mushroom plus predominant harmala combination vegetable television, because it's approximately that engaging, but very, very non-threatening and reassuring for beginners.
Repeat that one again.
That's a half dose of mushrooms. After an hour and a half, smoke a quarter of a teaspoon of predominant harmala seed.
Can the seeds be eaten instead?
Oh yeah, they're very small and hard and black, and you'll want to get a broad coffee grinder. A broad coffee grinder is a great tool for the would-be psychoactivist. It will flour nutmeg, reduce nutmeg to flour. Nutmeg's fascinating. I used to take it when I was in high school. I used to take it at night, and I would stay up late and study. It would sort of wire me, and then I would sleep. But when I would wake up in the morning, I would be absolutely smashed. And I didn't even know what it really was. It was almost before I smoked